All right. Thank you everybody for coming. I think we'll go ahead and get started, even though some folks might be popping in at the last minute. So my name is Julie Keats. I'm professor and chair of the Department of Human-Centered Design and Engineering at the University of Washington. And I'm honored to welcome you to our 2021 Distinguished Speaker event and thank our guest, Professor Helen Nissenbaum, for joining us. I want to first start out by acknowledging the Coast Salish peoples of this land on which we are working today. The land which touches the shared waters of all tribes and bands within the Suquamish, Tulalip, and Muckleshoot nations. We respectfully acknowledge their stewardship of this land throughout the generations. During this year of upheaval, it continues to be my top priority as department chair to sustain our close-knit community in HCDE and across our field. Guest lectures are an important opportunity for a community to come together in shared learning. The HCDE Distinguished Speaker Series was created in order to provide a community event where students, staff, faculty, alumni, and friends could gather together to hear talks by people that have been innovating boldly and thinking deeply about topics that have profound impact on human-centered design and engineering. The Distinguished Speaker Series would not be possible without the generous support of members from our community. I want to first thank former HCDE Chair Judy Ramey and friend of the department, Stephanie Rosenbaum, for sponsoring the lecture series from HCDE since 2009. We are honored to continue their legacy. I'd also like to recognize our friend, Jing Dejong Chen, whose endowment aims to broaden understanding of human-centered design issues in cybersecurity and privacy. Thanks to her investment, we were able to have Dr. Nissenbaum with us today. Finally, I want to thank our HCDE staff, especially Zoe Bartholomew, Leah Pistorius, and Stacia Green, and the research committee in HCDE, spearheaded by Associate Professor Charlotte Lee, for their efforts in organizing this event today. I'm now going to hand things over to Professor and Associate Chair Beth Kolko to introduce our distinguished speaker, Dr. Helen Nissenbaum.
Thanks, Julie. So I would like to thank all of you for attending today, and thank you to Dr. Helen Nissenbaum for being with us today. I am especially excited to welcome Dr. Nissenbaum. She and I met many years ago at a symposium that was a pivotal moment in my intellectual life for many reasons, mostly because of my conversations with Helen, if I may call you Helen.
Of course.
So I'm going to set the scene for those of you in the audience. It was 1995. It might actually have been 1996. Neither Helen nor I can remember, and I couldn't find any online record of the event. I tried, but it was a symposium about the internet. It was in Jackson Hole, Wyoming, and Helen, I, and John Perry Barlow were keynote speakers for the event. So one of the things that I remember most from the event was giving my talk and then sitting in a cafe at the venue. It was closed, but somehow Helen and I had managed to secure ourselves some coffee. And she's sitting across the table from me and she says, "Your work is fascinating, but what is your field?" And from there, we launched into a conversation about the need for interdisciplinarity in order to make sense of increasingly ubiquitous online systems. Helen doesn't know this, but that conversation emboldened me in my own work and helped encourage me to move from the humanities to engineering just a few years later. In 1995 or 6, in the late 90s, let's say, the internet was just emerging from being a text-based medium. And this was against a backdrop where anonymity online was considered largely a positive development. The online world had plenty of trolls back then, but we didn't have bots. Helen was at the forefront, even then, one of the only scholars asserting that questions of trust and privacy and their interplay would be key factors in how emerging technologies would come to shape interactions and institutions. I want to take a moment and recognize her prescience 25 years ago in identifying what would be fundamental challenges to growing technological infrastructures. So she is here today to speak on her work regarding contextual integrity, research which builds on her continued outstanding intellectual contributions and that continues to provide bold and insightful guidance on how we can all think more critically and practice more carefully the work around technology design. So it's my pleasure to introduce Helen to you all today. She is a professor at Cornell Tech in the Information Science Department as well at Cornell University. She is also director of the Digital Life Initiative, which was launched in 2017 at Cornell Tech to explore societal perspectives surrounding the development and application of digital technology, focusing on ethics, policy, politics, and quality of life. Helen's research takes an ethical perspective on policy, law, science, and engineering, related to information technology, computing, digital media, and data science. Her research has delved into issues of privacy, trust, accountability, security, and values in technology design. Her books include Obfuscation, A User's Guide for Privacy and Protest with Finn Brunton, and Privacy in Context, Technology, Policy, and the Integrity of Social Life. The title of our talk today is Contextual Integrity, Breaking the Grip of Public-Private Distinction for Meaningful Privacy. If any of you have questions during the talk or the Q&A portion, please submit your questions by clicking the Q&A button that should be at the bottom of your Zoom window. And with that, please join me in welcoming Helen.
All right, so thank you so much, Beth. I have to say it was like what they call a blast from the past when I got your email to invite me to give this lecture, and it was just so wonderful, you know, just to go back to that crazy time and try and trace a trajectory. Now, I don't know that I certainly didn't feel prescient in any way. I just knew that these were such fascinating questions, and I didn't think that a philosopher could solve them without so many other people in different disciplines. So here we are, and let me do the share screen thing. Oh, so it popped on nicely, just like that. All right, I am grateful and excited to be here. This is an amazing group of people for me to be presenting my work to, because I feel like you're in the trenches with me, and hopefully some of what I say will connect with what you do and some thoughts that you have. And I also want to say that I was so excited to be here that I might have stuffed just a little bit too much into my talk. So don't think I'm crazy. If you leave this talk with just some of the things I've said staying in your brain, I'll be happy. And of course, I would be delighted to share more and carry on the conversation. And so here goes. I'm also happy that you were interested in hearing me talk about privacy, because I have to say that, you know, there's always like a shiny object in our field. And now there's so much attention to AI and ethics, it warrants that attention. But what I fear is that by turning away from issues of privacy, we fail to understand, or we fail to realize how important getting things right, or even getting things better with respect to privacy, is so intricately connected to some of these important questions of AI and ethics. So I'm happy to go there if need be. Let me see. Sorry. Okay, so here's the talk overview. I want to talk a little bit about why contextual integrity, really like why privacy, what gripped me about privacy, what is contextual integrity, and how does it differ from other ways of thinking about privacy, some applications and some potential challenges. There are many people, and I'm not even sure that I've listed everybody, but there are many people along the way who've helped develop contextual integrity with me, both the theoretical aspects of it and also showing that contextual integrity, the framework of it, could be applied in design and in formal languages, and also could be adapted to empirical social science research and so forth. So led me along different pathways. Now, back now to the talk outline, why privacy, why contextual integrity. And this is a slide that I use often when I'm talking about privacy, because I like to mention that though I have a PhD in philosophy, I didn't approach the issue of privacy to say, oh, privacy, it's such a rich concept, and I'm an ethicist or a political philosopher, and now I need to understand privacy from a philosophical and, of course, a legal perspective. It was more looking at this range of technologies, some, that we already were aware of at the time that Beth and I were meeting so many years ago. And now, as I use this slide, I'm constantly, sorry, I see a typo, forgive me. I'm constantly updating, obviously without thinking too much about it. I should have applied my spell checker. But anyway, obviously updating all the time. But the important thing for me to reckon with is when people observe what's done with these technologies. And of course, whenever I say technology, please just know that what I mean is socio-technical systems, because it's never, the bare technology as if it could be functioning on Mars. So what is it when people see some of the applications of these technologies and they complain, they cry out that privacy has been violated? And I wanted to show you that this is a very curious thing that I came across. Etc. Discovery and invention have made it possible for the government by means far more effective than stretching upon the rack to obtain disclosure in court of what is whispered in the closet. The progress of science in furnishing the government with means of espionage is not likely to stop with wiretapping. Ways may sometimes be developed by which government, without removing papers from secret drawers, can reproduce them in court, and by which it will be enabled to expose a jury the most intimate occurrences of the home. Advances in the psychic, that might give things away, and related sciences may bring means of exploring unexpressed beliefs, thoughts, and emotions. So this was written in 1928 by Brandeis, and many of you in the famous Olmsted v. United States, where this was a dissenting opinion, which then was overturned 50 years later. But just to show that the idea of technology threatening privacy in these ways isn't something brand new to us. So we hear people claim privacy is violated. And it was fascinating to me to say, well, why are people angry? What are they afraid of? Why do we think that these actions are morally wrong? And that led me to this quest for what I like to call a meaningful account of privacy. And I mean by that the philosopher's task, to begin with, of defining a concept that's clear and rigorous, but also more the social scientist's concept, to find one that's true to us, that it makes sense, that it responds, that most of the time when people say, oh, my privacy is being violated, this account actually captures that. And we also want a value that's ethically legitimate, so that we can claim that when someone's privacy has been, let's say, threatened or reduced or placed at risk, there's something wrong with that and we need to do something about it. And it's worth defending with technology and policy. So that's what we are after. And in particular, the events that really shaped my interest, and this is really responding, I wanted to have a theme around which to discuss contextual integrity, because really the goal of this talk today is to present contextual integrity as an answer to these challenges, a response to the quest for a meaningful conception of privacy. But Lotus Marketplace Households, as you can see, and I hope you've been reading, was, I have to say, by today's standards, was child's play. But what was important about it was when Lotus and Equifax are eventually, under a lot of pressure, decided to withdraw the product, they said, we weren't doing anything wrong. because we were simply using data that came from public sources. And therefore, we weren't violating privacy. And much later, when people started worrying about Google Maps Street View, the defensive initially, when Google didn't want to do anything about anything, now it's like blurring faces and so forth. Their argument again was, we have every right to drive around on the roads and capture information, capture images from public spaces. No privacy issues are raised because these are public places. This seemed wrong, and many people weren't buying. Of course, we were already in that phase that it was, you know, tough luck, law doesn't help you any. And these arguments held sway. So what is contextual integrity and how does it address these issues? What these cases do, and many of the cases that I bring to bear in order to showcase contextual integrity and how it differs, I think of it as a prism. I run these cases and then we see how the different theories respond to these cases. So, for example, we might think about facial recognition systems used in public places. Do they violate privacy? And there's, I know, you know, major discussions going on, ban the scan in different cities, happening in New York and potentially in other places. You know, and here's facial recognition as augmented reality in glasses. And so how do we think about this using contextual integrity? And there are going to be a lot more examples as we move along. So this is a whirlwind pass through contextual integrity. And I want to present it to you in a modular way. So there are 4 key ideas that I've identified, and I'm going to introduce them progressively. And I have to say that at times when I present these 4 key ideas, people will say, oh, Helen, you know, I really agree with the first one, but no, then you've lost me. But it's okay. You know, I want to show how they build on each other, and we can see the various interdependencies. I'm prepared to defend all of those key ideas, but this is a discussion for us to have. So what's the first key idea? The first key idea, oh, sorry, I forgot I had this slide. Sorry, that really broke the drama. But what we have, the way I'm going to present it so that we see this prism effect is I'll describe what the key idea is, and then I'll contrast it. Here's what it is, here is how it's different. So the first key idea is that privacy is about appropriate flow of information. Just that basic idea, which may seem, nothing to it. On the other hand, it really contrasts with a million computer science papers where privacy is presented as secrecy, and any data that may leak, that you often see this notion of leakage, because it's like a non-moral concept, is considered a violation of privacy. So privacy in this case is secrecy, and leakage is a violation. And in privacy by design, there's this concept of minimization, and it basically says any reduction of the amount of information, like data minimization, is considered to be giving people more privacy. Now, that's the first key idea. Privacy is appropriate flow. So when people say, oh, privacy, it's such a complicated concept, no wonder we're having such trouble. I say, calm down, it's very simple. Privacy is appropriate flow of information. And then they say, well, what do you mean by appropriate flow? And the answer that I give is that it conforms with norms or rules. It meets people's expectations. And the number 4 key idea, so you'll see in a little moment why I'm doing, I can count, but this is just, you know, how I'm laying it out at the moment, is that in fact, it's legitimate norms or rules worth defending, they're morally justifiable. And I say norms or rules because, again, talking to computer science colleagues, they really don't like the word norms, unlike the humanists and the social scientists. And so we talk about rules instead. But now let's just focus on the key idea number 2. This is where contexts come into play. First, so what we really mean, to spell it out, is that flow conforms with contextual informational norms or rules. So appropriate flow meets expectations. So we connect up here with some of the legal concepts of a reasonable expectation of privacy. Now, there's a social theory that underlies this second idea, and that is that social spheres, we live in a social life that isn't an undifferentiated social space, but rather we have these differentiated social spheres. And here I don't invent the idea, but rather I'm drawing on ideas that I read about from social philosophy and theoretical social sciences. And I'm now giving you the basic ideas behind what characterizes context. Importantly, they're characterized by purposes, goals, and values. They're characterized by distinctive ontologies of roles or capacities in which people act, certain practices, and just, it's nothing magical, but when we think about healthcare, education, family, these are all contexts. And then we have norms, and the norms govern how people behave in these contexts. And among the norms are informational norms, which could be implicit, could be explicit, and these are the norms or the rules that govern the flow of information in a particular context. And the claim is that we know if just by living in society, we know a lot about when data or information flows conform with the norms. Now, number 3, this is where the third key idea comes in. So maybe you agree with me so far. You say, you know, the law also agrees with me. If we want to find out if privacy has been violated, we have to show that people's reasonable expectation of privacy have not been met, and that's a signal that privacy has been violated. Adding to that, contextual integrity proposes that these rules have a certain structure. This is really important to the big argument. And I've learned from my computer science colleagues, this is the CI tuple. There are 5 parameters, 5, not 5. And they are actors, subject, sender, recipient, information type, and transmission principle. So, and when we talk about actors, remember there's always this contextual ontology of actors. It's people acting in certain capacities. The norms govern flow in terms of, there's a meaning when we're talking, when we're mapping these flows, and we characterize the flows in meaningful terms. We have information type, specific things, age, gender, books you've read, so forth, so on. And hopefully you've been reading a long while, because I'm not going to read everything in the slide. And then there's this parameter called transmission principle. And this is, the other parameters are known in a lot of the role-based approaches to privacy, but this transmission principle, we always understood it to be there. I think it's quite intuitive, but this theory makes it explicit, which is it's the terms under which the information flows, the constraints under which the information flows. So in the very common thought of privacy, you're providing information with consent. With consent is a transmission principle because that is the constraint under which information flows, but it doesn't always require consent. So when you're filing your income tax returns, it's not that you're consenting to provide the information, you're being coerced, you're being compelled. That's a law. It requires that you provide. And of course, information can be bought and sold. It can be a one-way flow. It can be reciprocal. So the physician gets to hear what your health complaints are, but you don't get to hear what the physician's health complaints are, and so forth. So there's certain, and then one important one is with a warrant. So it's really important in the law, and we see this over and over again with the Fourth Amendment. Did the police have to get a warrant in a certain instance of search? And if they didn't get the information with a warrant, then we say, well, it was unlawfully gained. So that happens. So this concept of transmission principle really covers a lot that's very familiar to us, but it identifies it. Now, I have this question mark near use, because over the years, I've had lots of debates with people as to whether I forgot I should have had 6 parameters, and the 6th parameter should have been use. And maybe those people are right. However, there are ways in which the use parameter, and I don't know if I'm going to have time to go into it. There are reasons for believing that the use parameter, which may not have been important at the time, have become increasingly important as we've entered these times that we're living in. But I'm just going to leave this up in the air. So here's, you know how it is, you learn the mathematical concepts and then you learn, here are the concrete instances, but here are some rules that fit the structure where travelers are obliged upon request to show the contents of their luggage to the TSA agent, to show how this well-formed sentence would mention different parameters. And I want to show you how some of our sectoral laws, so this comes from HIPAA, when they write the rule, they actually do use these parameters, which was, I wouldn't say proof, but it was very heartening because it suggests that these parameters capture something intuitive in how people want to think about and evaluate data flows. And this one is, I always use this one, I like it a lot, because it goes against the common wisdom that you always need the data subject's permission to share information. And in this case, what we're saying is that actually it's only with authorization from the psychiatrist that this information can flow. And this work, by the way, comes from a paper from these guys. They developed formal language and very excited, maybe we can use this formal language to implement or enforce in a computer system. Okay, so here we are. I promised that I would show you the connection between the key ideas and other approaches or other ways of thinking about privacy. And here I wanted to just raise this little flag and say, this particular way of thinking about privacy, which conforms with contextual informational norms, and the norms having this structure is different from two dominant ways of thinking about privacy. One is that privacy protects only the private. So we're very much dominated by this dichotomy of private and public. And privacy only applies to the private. And another dominant definition, which comes from Alan Weston, privacy is control over personal information. How many articles, countless, even progressive thinkers on privacy end the article. I'm thinking about, the New York Times had a recent series on privacy. What we need is to give people control over information about ourselves. Please, one thing to take away, this kills privacy. This is the death of privacy. And we really need to have a revolution, and we're going to have a revolution, everybody, and it is to reject this definition of privacy as control over personal information. So this idea, we back now to the Google Maps Street View, privacy only applies to the private. In the case of the public, all bets are off. And contextual integrity says, no, we don't divide the world into two things. We don't say public information, private information. We have a much more richer understanding of this informational and spatial ontology that comes from social domains. We cannot build privacy on top of this private-public dichotomy. It doesn't match up. And then when we want to think about why privacy is control over personal information has led us, has resulted in us being beached when it comes to privacy. And I should say that it stems from what was initially a great idea, Code of Fair Information Practices, but ultimately builds on this idea that the right to privacy is the right to control. Fast forward to the present, and I'm not going to spend too much time. I'm whipping through these. This is where we get to when we have the operationalization of privacy as control. We have these privacy policies, and I have a whole nother talk about privacy as control and privacy policies, but I just want to bring to attention something we all know very well. And the conclusion of this quick little foray. So now we have a first approximation of a definition of contextual integrity. Contextual integrity is preserved when information flows conform with entrenched informational norms. And there's an assumption of what these norms are. Now, like any norms, they're contested, they're sometimes controversial, they're not 100% held and so on, but here's the first approximation. And the point, how this connects with technology, remember the whole list of technologies that I presented at the beginning, is that these technologies raise flags and make people crazy, because what they're doing is they're disrupting the information flows. And when I say disrupting the information flows, if you're a privacy as control person, the only disruption that is worth mentioning is whether this flow happens without someone consenting. But when you hold contextual integrity as your framework for privacy, then what you mean is that you can capture the disruption by some alteration in the data, in the values for the parameters that come about when you introduce certain kinds of technologies. So when we go back to our facial recognition technology. The public, if it's in public, you have these Fourth Amendment plain view doctrine that says, if it's in plain view, then no holds barred. Obviously there's a lot more detail. When you are privacy as control, then if you choose to share the information, and choose is like you arrive at, a website, whatever it is, and you are implicitly agreeing, then then it's like, well, you've agreed to share this information under these and these terms, and that party can do whatever it likes as long as it doesn't violate the terms of the privacy policy. But what privacy as contextual integrity says, and I'll be, fairly specific about it, is that, first of all, when you're walking around in public, so we're looking at the hardest case, facial recognition in a public space, there's certain, even if you accept that there's certain information that can be captured, traditionally, or what the expectation is, your name is not known, your identity is not. And now with facial recognition, we have a novel flow. We have a disruptive flow. Suddenly, the information type changes because now your name flows. And second of all, because of the technology, it's not just like, I see someone across the street, but rather the image can be captured and it can flow to all sorts of places. And so it's not the case, oh, public is public, anything goes. This really constitutes a change. And privacy as contextual integrity gives you a finer grained way of revealing what the changes are. When I talk, say, with students about surveillance technology like drones and cameras, what I say to them is, please don't get all worked up about these technologies, because you want to understand that these technologies can be designed in different ways, and you as a technology designer can decide, are you going to store the data? Is the data real time? Who gets access to the data? How fine grained is it? Does it feed into a facial, so many different questions that are relevant to what the privacy dimensions are of these systems. It really belittles, it doesn't give enough attention to the importance of what's relevant in these systems by just waving your hand and attacking the systems whole cloth, but it really requires a design approach. Here's another experience that we had in the past few years, just to give you a little bit of a heads up. The voter roll information and voter registration information, it's a state-by-state decision, and many states, most states, in fact, voter roll, which is whether you voted in an election, is public. And yet, when this commission on voter fraud requested the information from states, the states said no, even though this information was public. So the argument of public is public, no holds barred, is belied. And I think people, I hazard a guess that most people were very relieved at this resistance. So all the parameters matter, and it doesn't serve us to overlook some of the parameters. Now I wanted to, let's see, how am I doing on time? We started. All right, gosh, I'm going to try and whip through this because this was the promise I made to you guys. I wanted to show how this is now my collaboration with people who do empirical work, empirical survey study, in particular, Kirsten Martin. And what we want to show is that when you pay attention to all the parameters, you can disambiguate a lot of bad survey stuff that has been going on for decades. So we looked at the private-public distinction, and we looked first at sensitive data, and then we looked at what's so-called public data. So the first article was showing confounding variables with sensitive data, and I just have a couple of slides for each of these studies. What we first did is we looked at the information types found to be most sensitive by the Pew Foundation. Now, according to the public-private dichotomy, we would say that you should really protect the most private, and depending on your theory of privacy, maybe secrecy, we hold these to be secret. When you add, and it feels so obvious, you know, when I show you these results, when you include the additional parameters into your story, you see that even the most sensitive data, health information, when it goes to a doctor, no problem. Obviously, when it goes to the most unpopular one was always the data broker, then we're very upset about it. So it's got you can't take the information and divide it into two categories and then know how to treat it. Then we showed the opposite. We wanted to show that even information in public databases, people felt that there were privacy interests. And I should mention that early days I had written an article, my first article on privacy was like, oh, revealing that there's privacy in public. Again, each time we used this factorial vignette survey approach, and we asked the question, is it okay? We spend so much time figuring out how to ask the question. We were trying to get at the norm. We didn't want to get the preference. So I'm sure that anyone who's been doing this kind of survey stuff knows like how you ask the question. And there's such fine-grained distinctions. We asked, is it okay? And what I wanted to point out is how, let me see what I can do here. Okay, so in the first case, we're saying a company receiving job information by information type, how okay is it to receive criminal data from a data broker, from government website, and from the subject, him or herself? And you can see the discrepancies. The one we kind of enjoyed a lot was, we imagine, you know, you're going to someone's party and you decide, ooh, that's a big house, I wonder how much they paid. So, you know, you look up online, go to, you know, what are those data broke, what are they called when you look up and you see what somebody...
Zillow or Redfin, those companies.
Yeah. So not nice, not appropriate. But if you ask the person what you paid, it's okay. It's not 100, but it's much, much better, and so forth. So really, these factors affect, you know, where going from negative to positive when you start adjusting the different parameters. And then finally, we looked, this was a much more complicated paper. It's just come out, privacy interest in public locations. And I mean, location tracking is it's huge. I'm sure you guys are aware of this. You know, this is the plain view doctrine. We did multiple rounds of this survey, and I'm just letting you look at it for, 10 seconds. And what we show, I mean, this is just a little fraction. I just mainly wanted to point out that what's important, by the way, is that it's not only who gets it by what means, which we used as a proxy for a transmission principle, but we also, especially Kirsten was interested in what happens when the location data allows you to draw certain inferences. And I was particularly interested in the place versus the GPS latitude, longitude, the kind of semantics of the location. So you can see, here's the FBI collecting this kind of location. But when you look at the data aggregator, everyone hates that. So these location aggregators that are out there that are, what are they called? Data location data brokers, and there are tons of them that, it's been discussed a lot. People really think it's unacceptable, but sometimes it's okay for the FBI. But anyway, you can draw conclusions. And the fascinating thing was when we were doing our pilots, we find people don't really distinguish the precision. So GPS, latitude, longitude, and which is what you can see, street, city, they're very close. But what did matter is location versus place. When you give semantics to it, that really causes different responses. Okay, so I've done all this, and I'm probably some of you are saying, tyranny of the convention. The whole point of technology is to disrupt data flows, and sometimes it's for the good. So isn't this a terrible theory that it always says that disruption is bad? So now we come to the fourth key idea, which is that it's not only that appropriate flow requires legitimacy. The norm needs to be legitimate. We want to allow for technologies that come in and make things better. And we also have to allow for the possibility that technologies can disrupt flow, look bad at the beginning, and then over time make an argument that in fact these technologies are not violating privacy. And so the theory has a way of evaluating these novel flows. It's a layered approach, and I'm going to be I'm not even going to spend time except to read the slide. We evaluate the differential impact on the affected parties or stakeholders, which is for individual costs and benefits. We evaluate them in terms of ethics and political principles. So there's fabulous literature on, how inadequate privacy can chill speech and freedom and autonomy and so on. And then the one that's the new contribution of this theory is contextual functions, purposes, and values. And I wanted to show you that around this time, Andrew Mellon proposed that IRS records, that tax records, go from being public to being private. And why did he say? He didn't say because it hurts people, it embarrasses them, et cetera, et cetera. His argument is it will mean that people will answer their tax returns honestly, and the Treasury will get a lot of money. So his argument was a societal contextual argument. Here's some ideas about purposes and values that the different, and this is just me, spinning it. I feel like each of everything I've said, take education, there's an argument to be had about what the ends and purposes and values are for educational context. And so now I want to come back to the definition, no longer a first approximation. And the definition is contextual integrity is preserved when information flows conform with legitimate informational norms. And there's work to be done to transition between entrenched. And the point is that sometimes we don't have entrenched norms and we need a way to evaluate flows. So, you know, with Cambridge Analytica, it was like, oh, people didn't give permission. And I'm thinking, who cares? What we care about is that it undermined democracy. That's what we need to care about. And I am going to, maybe I'll ask, I don't know, Julie, how am I doing? How many minutes can I have more?
It depends on how many questions you want to be able to answer. We do have about 6 questions that people have asked so far, but
5 minutes?
Sure, 5 minutes sounds great.
Okay, great. Because that's, I think, let me just see. Yeah, so I'm not going to go into this article. This was an early article. There was a debate going on in various states about posting court records online. There too, the argument was, court records, they're public records. What difference does it make if it's a file in a drawer in a courthouse or a click away on a website? Now, any of us sitting here know how enormous that difference is. But once again, it was like public is public. What does the medium matter? And this article carefully shows how when you change to a different medium, you affect the values of the parameters. And then again, we ask the question, when you change the flows, what values are you promoting? What harms are you bringing on board by making a very thoughtless change in the medium without going through this analysis? And finally, we'll come back, you know, to this case we've been looking at. And again, we show there's a disruption. That's really important. And then we discuss, when we evaluate the disruption, first we have to show it using a more fine-grained measurement, which is the 5, you know, the CI tuple. We then have to discuss, and of course, many of the arguments are just to throw one off the cuff. You know, people won't go and protest because maybe they're afraid, undermines democratic values. And this is the last one. Thanks to Batya Friedman. I don't know if she's here today, but she, a few days ago, sent me this example of the ancient, like hundreds of years old letters that were folded in a way that if you would unfold them, it would break them. And so there was the application of X-ray technology to be able to unfold without damaging the artifact and actually read the words of the letter. And you might say to yourself, oh, well, we can now read letters in envelopes because we have this X-ray technology. What the heck? Now letters, even in envelopes, are public because we can read them with technology. And once again, this is not the way to argue. You need to go through the steps and see what the disruptions are and how that affects long-held values. So this is the conclusion. Still holds an iron grip. CI reveals misalignment. I continue to believe that these dominant ideas are detrimental to individual interests and denigrate societal and contextual values. My approach would be to regulate with substantive rules informed by legitimate norms, sometimes involving control, but not always, but using these ends, purposes, and values as the arbiters. There's a lot of work to be done, a lot of work. and I welcome anyone to join in the effort. We really need to change things up. And that's it. Thank you. Should I unshare now for the Q&A?
Yes, please. David Rebus is going to be our Q&A maestro.
Hi, Helen.
Hello.
I'm going to read out the questions for you, but you can follow along too if you like in the Q&A box. Are you in the mood for, Helen, for some very high philosophical questions, or would you like to start with more grounded questions?
Give me an assortment.
All right. Okay. Let's begin with Mark Hasselkorn's question. He asks, "Hi, Helen. My question is about government databases that can be used to provide public benefit. So, for example, to manage a major emergency and its impact on regional systems. But that government is loath to create because they may contain private information and become targets of a FOIA and public disclosure request. Can contextual integrity help us find the appropriate balance?"
Yeah, so this is a great question. It's a good question that some computer scientists or, some policymakers want to answer by saying, let's create the databases and then make them accessible through differential privacy so that we can extract, the usual, privacy utility trade-off, which is an issue for me. And my pushback on this, and it's not universal, because I'm not saying that approach isn't acceptable in some cases. I think that for many cases, and I know there's a whole discussion of the census making the data available in a differentially private way. What I want to say is that if you consider the different parameters, there are ways of providing the information different from the threat model that differential privacy solves. So I prefer to offer a variety of approaches to say, you can create the databases, certain people will have privileged and what that is, or to use this data, and or you're held accountable for certain uses of the data. We create a system where we try and constrain the flow of that data according to the different parameters. And I think right now we've talked about either releasing it all, or having it be and having it be anonymized, which we know it cannot do, or differential privacy, which also has problems. And I want to offer a different alternative to it, where we might even make the data available in ways that could reveal identity, but we do it in a way that's constrained.
I'm going to stick with another somewhat on the ground question. Caitlin Quirk asks, as cyber-physical technologies become the norm in the built environment, especially for Internet of Things devices, how do we ensure that the norms are morally justifiable? Do you see privacy concerns with aggregate data collected by IoT device systems?
I'm not really sure why the IoT, I can understand why IoT devices escape the standard notice and choice regime. I'm not sure. First of all, when we say aggregated, there are different ways of aggregating. So it could be that if you have some kind of fitness device, and I imagine that Caitlin might include fitness trackers as an instance of an IoT device, then you might actually want that fitness tracker to keep track. It could be useful for you to keep track of aggregate, like how much did you walk this week, or was it better than last week, and so forth. And my colleague Deborah Estrin calls this small data versus big data. When you're talking about aggregating across contexts, so we're going to combine this data with shopping data and so forth, then we have glaring violations of contextual integrity. And we need to run these flows again through the machinery of the norms. I don't know if I answered. Caitlin, you can come back if I didn't answer your question.
I'll look out for that. All right, let's shoot up to maybe the highest level question in the deck. But I think it's a fair question for a philosopher.
Okay.
Scott Mainwaring asks, well, first he's
Hi, Scott. Yeah.
Yeah. My question is about the conception of information the contextual integrity theory appears to rest upon. The metaphor of flow suggests metaphorically that information is a fluid object, something that objectively exists in the world, as opposed to, say, to ideas from critical theories that information is not quote unquote real, but for example, in some versions, a social construction that is always in danger of being destabilized. Would you agree that contextual integrity depends on this kind of stabilized, unproblematic idea of information? If so, does this create strengths and weaknesses of your approach?
When it's interesting, so the term flow was the term I chose out of a lot of different terms that I was considering at the time, because I wanted to not make assumptions about anything that was happening on the two ends. And here I am, I'm stuck with it. And the other thing I'm stuck with is the word context, which has caused me no end of heartburn. But I think your question, I don't know that I understand your question as deeply, in the depth, to the correct depth. But I will say this, that when you take information of a certain type, and of course, the semantics of the information is not God-given, it's constructed within the context, and I am committed to that the ontology, that different contexts are defined by different informational ontologies, passes from one party to another party, and the meaning of that data, that information, when it arrives to the other party, could change dramatically. And I want to just give it a very practical, give a very practical reason, because when it goes from this party to that party might have a bunch of other information that gives a whole lot of different meaning to that information when it arrives. And this is why we have to be careful to not just talk about party A and party B, but rather actor in a certain capacity and actor in another capacity. So I might have a headache, tell the physician, and the physician interprets that data. That data gets a meaning depending on its arrival. I don't know if that's what you meant, Scott, and probably what you meant was deeper than that, but I do accept that the meaning changes in ways, and that by including the recipient as a parameter, you're allowing us to place constraints on what I'm calling flow, which is just passage of data from one party to another. Whew, great question. I'd love to talk about it for hours, but I won't.
Let's, I'm just going to allow Mark Hasselcorn to do a follow-up. Just to remind you, his question was about government databases.
Yeah.
That was the first
Yeah.
question.
Sure.
His follow-up is, so we can restrict individual access for public good. He's asking, I guess, is that what you're saying?
Not quite as bluntly, because because we can restrict in different ways. Yes, so the answer is yes, restrict, but we can restrict in different ways. And it used to be the case, just to give you an example, that if you wanted information out of a court record, you would go to the courthouse and you would be able to look at the material in the folder. And that restricted access materially in a certain way. The data brokers got around that because they hired people whose job it was, and I saw this, you would go to the courthouse, you would, claim all these, and then they would just sit there and they would transcribe the information. So there are various ways that you can impose restrictions. You can impose use restrictions, etc. I think we don't want to fall into the computer science trap that says, if you can do it, that's all that matters. And we have to say, well, you can do it, but we're going to make it not okay. Just as companies impose restrictions on, how you might use a copyrighted movie or something like that. We can do it, and then we need to think about that. But it's important when it's not like public interest writ large. It's to understand what's being served when we do that. So when we think about court records, the court record played an important function in the way the courts functioned, whether to achieve fair outcome, equal outcomes for similar cases and so forth. But then they became a mechanism to attach a reputation onto somebody. And that's when things went wrong. So we have to really define what that interest is. Or, yeah.
Amy Kelly. Very simply written question, but I think it's quite deep. Hi, Helen. I am wondering, who gets to decide what the privacy norms should be in different contexts?
Yes.
Who should be responsible for ensuring that those norms are protected, either by design or other means? And 3, how can we trust, how much trust can we place in developers and especially users of various technologies to uphold privacy norms and goals?
I love that question. The first one was who gets to decide. The second one is
who should be responsible for ensuring that the norms are protected, either by design.
Yeah. I feel like maybe I placed you in the audience and paid you to ask that question. So, because I don't know who gets to decide, because we have norms. And by the way, I'm aware that a lot of the norms that govern us, and looking at it, I'm not a critical theorist, but I've been schooled by my critical theory colleagues who say that, don't give too much credence to entrenched norms, because these entrenched norms may represent the interests of the powerful in society, whatever gender, race, socioeconomic, and not reflect the interests of everyone. And by the way, that is sometimes how technology can disrupt things in a good way. So how norms become established in a society is, when I say I don't know, it's not like oh, I forgot to figure that out. It's to say, there are other people who are much better qualified than me who have studied the evolution of norms in society, and sometimes the norms are not, equally good. But we're going to assume that if we have a kind of reflective, if we have a set of norms that we've reflectively evaluated, then who is responsible for enforcing those norms, or even passing the norms down from generation to generation? And the answer is, it's so interesting and complex. Not all norms get embodied into explicit rules. We know that law is one vehicle for, is that responsible vehicle for promulgating and enforcing norms, but norms can be family law. You can be, your friends can push you away if you violate norms. You could be part of a professional society that is defined by a set of norms, and if you violate, etc. So there are many societal mechanisms for both expressing norms and for enforcing the norms. And then the third question about how much trust to place in users and developers. Part of what we try to do when we teach, when we do things like this, is to create some sense of consciousness, first of all, that those people who are designing our systems pay attention. So if you're designing a drone with a camera, think about data flows, and then should we trust you if you're working for a company that's invasive, and etc. So there's a lot of attention on things like professional ethics. I think some of this is about trust and about promulgating in various different ways, and some of it is about law and enforcement. Sometimes we have to enforce the constraint in design, and this, Beth, back to this discussion of values in design. Sometimes we enforce it in design, but design isn't the answer by itself.
I think this is going to be our last question.
Okay.
From Joe Bernstein. It is the most upvoted question. I design enterprise tools for information privacy and protection. Most of our use cases aren't voluntary, but for policy compliance, such as GDPR. Do you think policy has negative effects of encouraging company to collect more information? The more tools we have to manage data sharing and attempt to protect from breaches, it feels like more companies now feel comfortable collecting data in the first place.
Well, that is so fascinating. Wow. I don't think I'm going to be able to give a really good answer to that question, because it gets into the mind of incentives and motivations. But I do feel that we all held high hopes for the CCPA and for the GDPR, and I'm afraid that the Achilles heel of both of these laws is that they utilize consent as this little loophole. And so no matter what the constraints are, they have. So with GDPR, there's one little bit of hopefulness in it, because when you specify the purpose, so the purpose specification, the ideal of it is that you can only specify a legitimate purpose. Now, if those folks were on their game, they would say, well, what do we mean by legitimate purpose? And now we run through the whole contextual integrity process. But I'm not seeing it happening. And I'm afraid that because they give such a big role to consent, we're going to just, it's going to be close to business as usual. But I realize I haven't addressed that question, because if you have a law that isn't very restrictive, then like kids, you know, they're going to push wow, I'm not collecting all that data. I think I'm going to collect more data because I'm allowed to. And I do see those weird backwards incentives. Thanks for that. Thanks for those great questions.
All right, thank you. I think I'll have Julie has some final words.
Yeah, thank you so much, Helen. That was really interesting. And thank you for taking the time to answer everyone's questions. So I want to thank everyone for joining us for our distinguished lecture today. And I want to join me in thanking Helen one more time, either in the chat or digitally clapping, or however you like to share your thanks with Helen one more time today. Also wanted to thank again to the research committee for putting together the event, as well as all the staff who put things together. So wishing everyone a happy Friday, and wishing you all health and wellness and perseverance until we can get together. Hopefully next year's distinguished lecture will be in person again, but now that we have such a great audience digitally, we can hopefully maybe have a hybrid next year. So looking forward to seeing you, and take care. Bye.
Thank you, Helen. That was awesome.
Helen.
Thank you, Helen. That was great.
Thank you. Thank you. Yes. Thanks. And see you soon.